If there were a date that truly put an end to the Beatles, I would argue that it occurred on January 28, 1969, at 3 Savile Row, London. It was there that the Beatles would meet with a man, Alan Klein. The band was just 2 days away from their iconic rooftop performance on the 30th. The documentary experiment had been in large part a failure so far, as it had essentially caught the band with its pants down. The idea for the film was this: the band is going back to basics. No more fractured recording sessions, no more extensive overdubbing. They are going to sit down, together, in a room, and make music. So much for that. Let's run down the list. John and Yoko are clearly suffering from heroin withdrawal, and John arrives at the sessions with very little material. Paul is in full freak-out mode, trying to pull everyone together in his own, not terribly effective, Conductor McCartney manner. George has a wealth of material, but much of it he keeps to himself, and the music he does present to the band is largely overlooked. Ringo, meanwhile, is just doing his best to show up and deal with it all. Oh, and the band is in financial straits due to their largely overambitious Apple Records, fashion, technology, etc. conglomerate. As it turns out, being musical geniuses does not necessarily translate to business acumen. Their band manager and mentor, Brian Epstein, is now a year and a half dead, but they are still under contract with his management company, now named Nimperer Holdings, owned by Brian's brother and mother, who are currently receiving and distributing all of the Beatles' earnings on their music, and taking 25% for the privilege of doing so. The Beatles are not happy about this. Time to rewind a bit. Alan Klein had had his eye on the Beatles for a while now. They were, simply put, the big fish. So when John let leak in a press comment that the Beatles would be broke in 6 months if things continued the way that they were, Klein pounced like a tiger, reaching out to John with the solution to all of their problems. Klein had a long history of negotiating contracts for musical acts, a skill that Epstein, for all his good intentions, had not been particularly adept in. Klein reeled in his first big catch when he became the band manager for the Rolling Stones. It was here where he really established the pattern that would define his career. Negotiate a better publishing contract for the band, get them a bigger slice of the pie. Then, he would deftly insert himself into the profit chain, making decisions and purchases that didn't necessarily benefit the band as much as it benefited himself. By the time Klein began hunting the Beatles, Mick Jagger was already beginning to grow distrustful of the manager. On January 26th, 2 days before he met with the rest of the band, Klein met with John alone, and by all accounts, charmed him.
I just think he's fantastic.
Really?
Yeah. You know, he knows everything about everything. Very interesting guy. I was there till 2 in the morning.
His approach, for his credit, was brilliant. Before you all try to purchase NIMS, before you move forward with all of this, let me look at your books. Let me gather all the information. And more so, I'll do it for free. No need to hire me on as band manager right now.
Alan Klein's here. Where's he gonna be? Should we go up to our room? Yeah. Oh, fuck it.
So we now come to the meeting of the 28th, and before they even walk in, there is a crack forming. Paul has a clear preference as to who he wishes to represent the band. Lawyers Lee Eastman and John Eastman, soon to be his father and brother-in-law. As you could imagine, the rest of them, who already felt leery over Paul's growing control over the band, did not feel so good about someone so closely connected to Paul managing the band. Not to mention the Eastmans had no track record, whereas the others could say, look, Klein has been doing this for years. John, George, and Ringo all agreed during the meeting to let Klein take a look into their financial affairs. Paul, on the other hand, would end up walking out of the meeting. They would play on the rooftop on the 30th, as for a couple of hours there, everything else faded into the background, and the Beatles would put on their first true live performance since 1966. The next day, the Let It Be sessions were over. What was to follow would prove to be the end of the Beatles, not only as a band, but a dissolution of personal relationships. But the Beatles still had one more record left in them. Welcome to the making of Abbey Road. It would be on the 1st of February that the Beatles and Klein would meet again, and this time, Lee Eastman would join the party. This meeting went even worse than the first one. Essentially, after more discussions about the potential purchase of NIMS, Lee Eastman decided he was tired of playing nice and launched a series of attacks against Klein based on one particular incident in Klein's recent past: his purchase of Cameo Parkway's records. What Klein had managed to maneuver was taking his own business, Klein & Company, public, meaning you can buy and sell stock for the company. And he did this via a reverse takeover of Cameo Parkway's, an already public trading company. If this doesn't make a lot of sense to you, I apologize, as I am not financially educated enough to explain this in great detail. But the gist is this: Klein pulled off a technically legal but undoubtedly dubious means of taking his company public. And Lee Eastman didn't think too highly of it. Klein, though, took the attack in stride, and by the end of the meeting, even suggested that Lee Eastman be hired on as the band's legal advisor, as a way to appeal to everyone at once. This did not resolve the negotiations, but it did serve one purpose: paint to the Beatles, namely John, George, and Ringo, a singular projection. Look at me. I'm a good guy. I don't want all the power. Sure, let Eastman, who just attacked me, represent you legally. I don't mind. And it worked. On February 3rd, Paul was outvoted 3-1, and Klein in the coming months was to be appointed the Beatles' new manager. Time for the show to go on.
My boys are ready to go.
The first song to be worked for Abbey Road was John's I Want You. But it would still be a good while before the Abbey Road sessions began in earnest. On this day, they recorded 35 takes of backing with a John guide vocal. One take also includes an interesting novelty, a version of the song in which Paul sings the vocal. Neat stuff. Of the song, John said in a 1970 interview, "A reviewer wrote of She's So Heavy, he seems to have lost his talent for lyrics. It's so simple and boring. She's So Heavy was about Yoko. When it gets down to it, like she said, when you're drowning you don't say, I would be incredibly pleased if someone would have the foresight to notice me drowning and come and help me. You just scream." The song would not be finished until August. Yoko Ono continued to pull John into her world. On March 2nd, they performed not before thousands of screaming young fans, but before a group of 500 or so college students from Cambridge. The gig was originally booked just for Yoko, although I am sure the organizer was thrilled when they heard that a Beatle would be joining the show. It was not to be a pop performance, however, but a half hour of experimental jazz, featuring feedback, screaming, and contributions of percussion, saxophone, and piano. The performance was taped and later released as Cambridge 1969 on Unfinished Works 2, Life with the Lions. And it's also interesting to see this duality in John, shifting from someone who actively antagonized and diminished the educated, upper-crust, artsy-fartsy crowd to someone who now actively participated in it. Here's a funny quote from 1980 when John spoke to BBC of this performance. He said, "The audience were very weird because they were all these sort of intellectual artsy-fartsies from Cambridge." He then added, "They were totally solid." It is now March 11th, 1969, and Paul McCartney just booked a register office for the next day and frantically bought a ring for £12 just before the shop closed up. And then on March 12th, Paul and Linda married. The other Beatles were not there.
Congratulations. How did you enjoy your wedding breakfast?
Fine, thank you. Lovely, yes.
When did you decide to get married, Paul?
About a week ago.
What prompted it?
So we decided to do it instead of thinking about it.
Linda, how do you feel about it all? You're obviously terribly happy. How are you feeling this morning?
Terribly happy.
That sounds good enough. Well, how about being the father to a 6-year-old child?
It's terrible. It's terrible. I hate it. I hate it, and it's going to be a terrible burden. I do. It's horrible. Yeah.
What are you going to do for the rest of the day? You're going to have a celebration later, perhaps?
Yeah, I'll take a bit of a rest first. It's been a bit hectic.
Meanwhile, at Kinfon's, Esher, Patty Harrison is at home. George Harrison is off at Apple offices. Patty hears several cars pull up into the driveway. Too many to just be George. Maybe Paul and Linda wanted to come by to party after the wedding, she thinks. The doorbell rang. She answers it to see a policewoman and her dog. The dog's name was Yogi. How ironic. Suddenly, the back doorbell rings. She is surrounded. A man introduces himself as Detective Sergeant Pilcher from Scotland Yard, and he hands Patty a search warrant. She knew who he was because just under 4 months prior, he had arrested John and Yoko. Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher already had an infamous reputation. If that name sounds strangely familiar, it is because John's line in I Am the Walrus was a reference to the sergeant. Pilcher made a point of targeting celebrities and musicians.
You know, Sergeant Pilcher was gaining great notoriety of just busting pop stars, you know, besides George and Mick and Keith and John, and always was the same cop. Nobody realized, you know, nobody put two and two together.
And while it may be a claim you expect to hear a guilty man plead, Pilcher had already been accused of framing, planting drugs on these individuals. And while this has never been officially confirmed, future misconduct by Pilcher will put doubt over his drug bust of the past. Patty tells the police, "Why are you doing this? We don't have drugs." But the police enter the home. She calls George. "George, it's your worst nightmare. Come home."
And Patty rang saying that Sergeant Pilcher was swarming all over the house in Esher. And George said to me, what should I do? You know, what should I tell Patty about this conversation?
George sent John's longtime childhood friend, Pete Shotton, to keep Patty company while he headed there. While they raided her home, the police asked Patty to make them some tea. She refused. Patty. So the policewoman made tea for them, and then they were standing around with it, not knowing what to do. One asked if they could watch television, so some did that, and one of the others said, "Have the Beatles been doing any new music?" "Yes," I said, "but you're not going to hear it." Eventually, George arrived and found us in the middle of the policeman's tea party. He was still calm, but he wasn't happy. The police were obviously excited to meet him. They stood to attention and were almost elbowing each other out of the way to get closer to him. Derek Taylor. George was calm about it. He went into the house and looked around at all these men and one woman and said something like, "Birds have nests and animals have holes, but man hath nowhere to lay his head." The police claimed to have found a large piece of hash in George's slipper. In response, George said, "I'm a tidy man. I keep my socks in the sock drawer and stash in the stash box. It's not mine."
And I said, well, if you've got this stuff there, just tell them where it is, George, because they'll find it anyway. You know, save yourself a lot of hassles, you know. And he said, well, he had a bit of grass, maybe a bit of hash in a box on the mantelpiece, right? So he rang Patty and told her to tell him where it was, you know. By which time they'd found a chunk this big in a boot in his wardrobe.
George and Patty were taken to the police station. 2 days later, John and Yoko suddenly decided to marry. This obviously had no relation to the fact that Paul and Linda just married, and in no way was an impulse decision between two codependent individuals. Well, who knows? So begins the Ballad of John and Yoko. On the same day as Paul and Linda's wedding, John drove Yoko up to meet his Aunt Mimi for the first time.
What did you make of his wife, Yoko Ono? Did you ever meet her?
Oh, yes, I met her. I've met her in London, and I've met her once down here. That was in the early days when he brought her. Well, I didn't know what it was all about. I wondered who it was. But I did say, "What do you do for a living?" to her. And she said, "I'm an artist." I said, "That's very funny. I've never heard of you."
Marriage was already on John's mind, as during the journey he asked his chauffeur, Les Anthony, to go to Southampton to inquire about the possibility of the wedding being held at sea on the cross-channel ferry to France.
We couldn't. We wanted to get married on the Cross Channel ferry. That was the romantic part when we went to Southampton, and then we couldn't get on because she wasn't English and she couldn't get that day visa to go across. And they said, anyway, you can't get married. The captain's not allowed to do it anymore.
Standing in the dockets of Hampton, trying to get to Holland or France.
The song, The Ballad of John and Yoko, is about as step-by-step autobiographical as a song can get, and we can trace each of these events with the lyrics of the song. And so on Sunday, March 16th, they did get to France, and did so by private jet, landing in Paris where they met with manager Peter Brown. And on their arrival to France, he gets the privilege of telling them, "No, you aren't French, you can't get married in France."
So we were in Paris and we were calling Peter Brown, who's now with Robert Stigwood, RSO. But we called him and said, "We want to get married, where can we go?" And he called back and said, "Gibraltar's the only place." So, okay, let's go. And we went there and it was beautiful.
Finally made the plane into Paris, honeymooning down by the Seine.
Peter Brown called to say, you can make it okay.
You can get married in Gibraltar, near Spain. They went directly to the British consulate office, where they were married during a 10-minute ceremony on March 20th.
It's the Pillar of Hercules, and also symbolically they called it the end of the world at one period. There's some name besides Pillar of Hercules, that they thought the world outside was a mystery from there. So that was like the gateway to the world. So we liked it in the symbolic sense, and the rock foundation of our relationship.
Within the hour, John and Yoko boarded a plane, left Gibraltar, and returned to Paris, where they had their honeymoon. On the 24th, they had lunch with Salvador Dali, and then early in the morning the next day, they drove to Amsterdam and checked into the Hilton Hotel, where they began their first bed-in for peace.
Drove from Paris to the Amsterdam Hilton, talking in our beds for a week.
We first did the bed-in in Amsterdam, and the point of the bed-in a nutshell was a commercial for peace as opposed to a commercial for war, which was on the news every day those days. And anyway, we did the bed-in. What the bed-in was 7 days, because the press were always asking questions. 7 days that they can ask anything, no secrets, you know. These guys were sweating to fight to get in first because they thought we were going to be making love in bed, you see. That's where their minds were at. Because we'd be naked, bed, right. John and Yoko.
Now let's take a moment to discuss this event. There is a large amount of controversy surrounding not only the bed-ins, but John and Yoko in general. And for a good portion of the public, the argument is as simple as this. They are hypocrites. John was an abusive husband. He had a prior history of violence. Who is he to be preaching peace? And how much easier is it to do so in the comfort of a luxury hotel room? What is this performative nonsense? What is lying in bed doing? And I want to acknowledge, yes, there is strong merit to those arguments. John was, and continued to be, a very flawed human being.
All that, I used to be cruel to my woman and beat her. That's me, because I used to be cruel to my woman and physically. Any woman. You know, I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself, and I fought men, I hit women, I was violent. That's why I'm always on about peace, you see. It's the most violent people that go for love and peace. And I sincerely believe in love and peace. But I am absolutely a violent man who has learned not to be violent and regrets his violence.
And just the idea for it.
The world, as a whole, idolizes so many people who have done so many terrible things. We see this with musicians, actors, politicians, you name it. And yet, because John publicly acknowledged his own cruelty and made an effort, superficially or not, to promote peace until the day he was shot dead, he is singled out. Peace? You beat your wife. No possessions? You're an incredibly wealthy man. There is a lot of gray here. The world is incredibly gray. But all I want to say, for my part, and this is in no way in defense of the terrible actions John did commit, but you can do a whole lot worse in this world than promoting peace. And it's not like John was preaching peace and then funding bombing campaigns. He was an imperfect man, and by all accounts, was often a terrible man. I think, though, despite that all, throughout his life, which ended so suddenly, he was trying to get better. The bed-in lasted an entire week and was filmed throughout. It was edited into a 40-minute film, Honeymoon, and John and Yoko also recorded audio during the bed-in, which later ended up comprising one side of their third experimental LP, the Wedding Album.
But nobody's doing anything about it except for a few people. And the things like the Grosvenor Square marches in London, the end product of it was just newspaper stories about riots and fighting.
On the final day of the month, they left the Hilton Hotel and flew to Vienna, where a film the two had directed, which for YouTube reasons I will call RAPE, premiered. We're going to take a quick detour to talk about the movie. If you are here solely for the Beatles and don't want to hear about Yoko's weird, upsetting movie, skip ahead to the following timestamp.
Now, in 1969, also in April, you did, which was a TV documentary in Vienna.
Well, it was filmed in London for Vienna, Austrian TV.
Right, for Austrian TV. How did that come about?
Well, it was just a filmic idea about just following a girl and keep following, just filming her. And what would happen to somebody who's totally exposed all the time, you know.
The basis of the movie is this. The cameraman, Nicholas D. Noland, was given this instruction from Yoko. The cameraman will chase a girl on a street with a camera persistently until he corners her in an alley and, if possible, until she is in a falling position. Let's hear from Yoko. The girl in the film did not know what was happening. Her sister was in on it, so when she calls her sister on the phone, her sister is just laughing at her and the girl doesn't understand why. Nick Nolan did the actual shooting. 21-year-old Hungarian Ivan Milata did not speak English. At the start, she is unsettled but friendly, welcoming the attention. But after being continually pursued despite her protest, she soon realizes that she cannot escape the camera. She is followed, then chased as she begins to run through the streets of London. She becomes so flustered that she runs into traffic. An attempted escape by taxi is also thwarted. She tearfully begs the cameraman to stop, but her pleas are ignored. Eva is eventually cornered in her own apartment with no escape. It was later discovered that Eva's passport was about to expire, which heightened her level of paranoia. At no point during the movie is Eva touched, but the effect is absolutely that of assault, of violation. Eva eventually learned the concept behind the film, but there is no doubt that the premise of the film is ethically fraught, no matter how powerful the end result. Unfortunately, Eva was brutally murdered in 2008. Okay, back to the Beatles. John and Yoko stayed at the Hotel Soccer, and it was there where they had a press conference from within a large white bag.
Great example, except for a few good cartoons that came out of it. We're willing to be the world's clowns because we think it's a bit serious at the moment and a bit intellectual.
They then spent the night there, where they enjoyed the famous rich chocolate cake soccer torte, which brings us to the end of our next verse.
Made a light trip to Vienna.
On the same day, back in England, George and Patty went to trial where they plead guilty. They were given an enormous £250 fine. However, they were also placed on probation for a year, and the charge would end up impacting George's efforts to attain a US visa in later years. We'll skip over to April 3rd, where John and Yoko appeared on another TV program, The Eamon Andrews Show, after having appeared on The Today Show just prior. This one, though, stands out due to the fact that it ended up combative.
Well, now let me bring on a pair of newlyweds recently returned from what must be the most publicized honeymoon in history. Up and about and out of the bag, let's welcome Mr. and Mrs. Lennon, John and Yoko. Well, now let me ask you what you've been asked since you came back. Just what were you after? What is this all about? What are you trying to achieve by doing these extraordinary, bizarre things, you and Yoko?
Well, everything we do is aimed at peace, you know. And we spent 7 days trying to communicate through the communication media, that's the press and TV, and to try and tell people who are interested in protesting to do something about it instead of sitting at home talking about it. And for the ones that are doing it in the streets.
Let me ask the audience here now, this was your objective. May I ask you, may I get a camera around on the audience? Are there any of you here, and please don't be afraid to put your hand up, who have thought more about peace because of any of the things that John and Yoko have done? Somebody there has put up a hand. Somebody here in the front row. Can we get a microphone Sorry. Can you tell me how this made you think more about peace, sir?
Well, I thought it was the biggest piece of rubbish that I'd heard for many, many years. If I can add to this, that when reading the story of them both being in this bag, I did actually wonder as to whether they were refugees from the Lambeth dustman strike.
Did you have a laugh?
Did I have a laugh? I think the example you set to some of the children and youngsters was nothing to laugh at.
What did you think was wrong with two people staying in bed?
The fact of you staying in bed, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if you stayed there longer, I think it would be better for everybody.
Okay, don't get insulted. Just look in the mirror before you get insulted. Now, what offended you about what we do?
Well, I'm sure I don't mind looking in the mirror. I think I see something better than looking at you.
Well, that's a matter of personal taste now. What offended you, basically? Can you really tell me what bugs you?
Well, not just the one item alone, your general attitude.
Oh, you don't
to the
like
youngsters,
attitude.
your general attitude to the youngsters in this country, of the way you lead them or attempt to lead them, and try to make out that you're not doing anything about it. One minute you tell us that you're trying to create peace in this world and everybody should be happy and joking, and the next minute you're telling us it's nothing.
All the while, mixes were being done for the upcoming single, Get Back and Don't Let Me Down. Paul, as far as I can tell, was the lone Beatle involved in these mixes, and obviously the engineering team. And on April 11th, the single was released, despite the associated sessions that would become Let It Be not being released until over a year later. The text for the press advertisements for the single were written by Paul. Get Back is the Beatles' new single. It's the first Beatles record which is as live can be in this electronic age. There's no electronic whatchamacallit. Get Back is a pure springtime rock number. On the other side, there's an equally live number called Don't Let Me Down. In Get Back and Don't Let Me Down, you'll find the Beatles as nature intended. It would hit number 1 and stay there for 7 weeks.
Standing in the dockets of Hampton, trying to get...
The Ballad of John and Yoko was recorded by John and Paul alone. Ringo was off filming The Magic Christian, and George was just off out of the country somewhere. The Ballad of John and Yoko was a very fast session, recalls engineer Jeff Emmerich, who was working on a Beatles session for the first time since he decided to quit working with them on the White Album. It was a really good record too, helped by Paul's great drumming and the speed in which they did it all. While the Abbey Road sessions do not have the dismal reputation of the White Album or Let It Be sessions, it was still very much not the Beatles of old. But it seems, for one session, and maybe it was the magic of John and Paul alone, that they recaptured that spark and joy in creating with each other. In a moment of classic Beatle humor, right before they launched into take 4, John yelled to Paul, who was playing the drums,
It got a bit faster, Ringo.
and Paul yelled to the guitar-wielding John,
Okay, George.
Take 10 was deemed the best for the basic rhythm track and vocal. They overdubbed bass, lead guitars, and piano. And knocked out the song with an hour of studio time left to spare.
1, 2, 3.
A couple of days later, the band, now together as a whole, began true takes on George's Old Brown Shoe, which they had rehearsed and recorded a demo for during the Let It Be sessions.
E with C? Yeah. Just including the E. Baby, I'm in love with you, and I'm so glad you came here. You know, be the same here, I'm telling you.
Being well practiced, the basic rhythm took only 4 takes. George recorded his vocal tucked into a small corner of the space to give it a tight but natural echo.
Put your sweet top lip on in the queue. Yeah. Baby, I'm in love with you.
The song's remarkable sounding bass line is actually a combination of bass and guitar, with Paul and George playing the same notes on top of each other. Paul also played the jangly piano. Now it was time to tackle another of George's songs, and perhaps his best song with the Beatles, Something. I had written Something on the piano during the recording of the White Album. There was a period during that album when we were all in different studios doing different things trying to get it finished, and I used to take some time out. So I went into an empty studio and wrote Something. I could never think of words for it, and also because there was a James Taylor song called Something in the Way She Moves.
Something in the way she moves,
which is the first line of that. And so then I thought of trying to change the words, but they were the words that came when I first wrote it. So in the end, I just left it as that, and just called it Something. Though it is horrifying to imagine, Something was almost not a Beatles recording. The demo was originally offered to Jackie Lomax, and then was given to Joe Cocker, who actually recorded his version before the Beatles.
Don't wanna leave now. You know I believe in now.
But thankfully, and no disrespect to Joe Cocker, his version was not released until after Abbey Road. Something was another track that had been worked a little bit during the Let It Be sessions.
No, I don't know. I don't know. Down, 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 down.
But the song's true potential had not yet been teased out.
Just say whatever comes in your head each time. It tracks me like a cauliflower until you get the word. You know?
According to engineer Jeff Emmerich, George had a smugness on his face when he came in with this one, and rightly so. He knew it was absolutely brilliant, and for the first time, John and Paul knew that George had risen to their level. There is also another story to share about Something, though the exact date that it occurred is unknown. It is in regards to the bass line on the song. Once again from Jeff Emmerich. Paul started playing a bass line that was a bit elaborate for Something, and George told him, "No, I want to keep it simple." Paul was obedient. There was no disagreement about it, but I thought something like this would never happen years before. George telling Paul how to play the bass? Unbelievable. Which, while I believe the story, I can't imagine how elaborate Paul's bass line was before. As it is still pretty elaborate on the final recording. A studio day in which just George and John were present. George finished up Old Brown Shoe, overdubbing organ and wiping over John's rhythm guitar. He then recorded a guitar solo to polish the song off. George hopped over to Studio 2 where he joined John, and the two of them went long into the night recording the powerful, ever-building guitar arpeggios that would serve as the finale for I Want You. John and George went into the far left-hand corner of number 2 to overdub those guitars, recalls engineer Jeff Jarrett. They wanted a massive sound, so they kept tracking and tracking, over and over. Four Beatles were again present at the studio on Sunday. A reduction track was made of I Want You to allow further overdubs, which included congas and organ played by Billy Preston. The swirling white noise that builds in the final minutes of the song was created by a Moog synthesizer and had not yet been overdubbed at this point. This synthesizer, still incredibly novel, would feature on a few of Abbey Road's tracks. Let's take a moment to go ahead and talk about it. The synthesizer took a long time to become the do-it-all musical machine that it is today. It all began in 1895 when Alfred Graham experimented with the connection between sound and electricity, resulting in a device called the electric musical tones. There was then a machine called the Singing Arc, which came shortly after. In the late 20s came the first synthesizer that is still widely recognizable, the theremin with its ghostly alien tones. Good Vibrations is an example of a pop song that uses the theremin to fantastic effect.
I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations.
In 1964 came the Moog synthesizer, the most powerful and accessible synthesizer made yet. It was made famous by Wendy Carlos with her work, Switched on Bach, which is exactly as it sounds. Works by Bach, translated to the world of the synthesizer. The Monkees were actually the first pop group to really use the synthesizer extensively on their 1967 album, Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited. Now, George Harrison had already been playing with the Moog for a little while before the recording of Abbey Road. By this time, he had already recorded music for his solo work, Electronic Sound. Which, for all the grief we give John and Yoko for their experimental works, this is just as much so. A new song would also be worked on this day, Paul's Oh Darling. Paul had spent quite some time rehearsing this song before recording began, as he had one particular goal in mind, to perfect the powerful lead vocal. I mainly remember wanting to get the vocal right, wanting to get it good, and I ended up trying each morning as I came into the recording session. I tried it with a hand mic, I tried it with a standing mic, I tried it every which way, and finally got the vocal I was reasonably happy with. It's a bit of a belter, and if it comes off a little bit lukewarm, then you've missed the whole point. The result speaks for itself, but if John had it his way, the lead vocal would have been his.
Oh Darling was a great one of Paul's that she didn't sing too well. I always thought I could have done it better. It was more my style than his, but he wrote it, so what the hell, he's going to sing it. But if he'd had any sense, he should have let me sing it.
On this day, though, the vocal was not the focus, as they spent 26 takes on the basic rhythm track, with just a very raw guide vocal from Paul. The roof of Apple headquarters is of course most famous for the boys' rooftop performance, but did you know that it was also where John changed his middle name to Ono? In a brief ceremony, that was exactly what happened. Yoko changed her name for me, I've changed mine for her. One for both for each other. She has a ring, I have a ring. It gives us 9 O's between us, which is good luck. 10 would not be good luck. Unfortunately, for the two of them, while John was able to add Ono to his name, British law did not allow him to officially revoke his middle name given at birth, which was Winston, which, if you notice, has an O in it, bringing the total O's between the two of them to 10. Sorry, guys. Later in the day, John and Yoko went to the studio to record another experimental piece to commemorate the name change. The two positioned themselves on the studio floor and recorded their heartbeats through the use of hospital microphones. They then called each other's names for 22 minutes. The song would be aptly titled, John and Yoko.
John?
Yoko?
John?
Engineer Jeff Jarrett shares a surprisingly wholesome recollection. The nice thing about working with John and Yoko was seeing just how much in love they were. They had a fantastic relationship, even though they took a lot of stick for it. The John and Yoko recording was fantastic, though quite unpleasant. John managed to get a hold of highly sensitive microphones from a local hospital, and we recorded their heartbeats. The mic was so good that you heard all the gurgling noises and everything going on inside the stomach. Time for another new classic, this being Ringo's Octopus's Garden, which we were lucky enough to see bits and pieces of in Get Back.
Underneath the sea, in an octopus's garden, in the shade.
They got to work on Octopus, and it would be a long but fun day as the sessions stretched from 4 in the afternoon till 4 in the morning. Jeff Jarrett once more shares an interesting anecdote, this time secondhand from George Martin, who had told Jarrett he would be unable to lead the session on this day. The quote simply describes the magic of working with all 4 Beatles at once. I was really thrown in the deep end. George Martin informed me that he wouldn't be available. I can't remember word for word what he said to me, but it was something like, there will be 1 Beatle there, fine. 2 Beatles, great. 3 Beatles, fantastic. But the minute the 4 of them are there, that is when the inexplicable charismatic thing happens. The special magic no one has been able to explain. It will be very friendly between you and them, but you'll be aware of this inexplicable presence. Sure enough, that's exactly the way it happened. I've never felt it in any other circumstances. It was the special chemistry of the 4 of them which nobody since has ever had. An interesting session here, and another fun one. John and Paul alone dusted off a 22-month-old rhythm track, that for You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. This bizarre, but surprisingly captivating track has been named by Paul as one of his favorite Beatles songs, in large part due to how much fun they had putting it together. The song runs the gamut of pastiche and parody, jumping from genre to genre, all while maintaining the same mantra-like phrase, You know my name, look up the number. This day was devoted to vocal overdubs for the song, as well as a number of wacky sound effects, such as Mal Evans shoveling gravel. The fact that this song ended up as a B-side for a single is remarkable, but unfortunately, the final version was edited down quite a bit, and the version released on Anthology is undoubtedly the more fun, complete version.
8-track to 8-track, something, take 37.
A remake of Something was made on this day, still composed only of the rhythm track. These earlier versions of the song stretched far longer due to an ambling, repetitious piano-led fade-out. Which, fun fact, John later repurposed this coda for his song, Remember. This song was directly embroiled in their present-day financial conflicts, namely those relating to Alan Klein. Here's Paul. This was me directly lambasting Alan Klein's attitude to us. No money, just funny paper, all promises and it never works out. And much like John's Happiness is a Warm Gun, the song is made up of 3 different sections, written in Paul's 1969 journal as You Never Give Me Your Money, Out of College, and One Sweet Dream. The song beautifully spans a number of emotions, frustration, nostalgia, and escapism. In regard to the lines, One Sweet Dream, pick up the bags and get in the limousine, Paul said, I'd got married to Linda, and our relationship offered some respite from the dreary infighting and the financial stuff. The lines, One Sweet Dream, pick up the bags and get in the limousine, were a reference to how Linda and I were still able to disappear for a weekend in the country. That saved me. As the song came to an end, the repeated line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all good children go to heaven, is backed by a guitar motif that would later return as the bridge between Carry That Weight and The End. It is not known the exact date that the medley was conceptualized, and if the song itself was thought to be part of the medley at this point. The Abbey Road medley, at one point called The Long One, is a true accomplishment, as shown by John's high regard for the work later in his life. In an interview he said of, You Never Give Me My Money, that's Paul. Well, that's not a song, you know. Abbey Road was really unfinished songs all stuck together. Everybody praises the album so much, but none of the songs had anything to do with each other. No thread at all. Only the fact that we stuck them together. Did I trick you? May 9th marked the release of prior mentioned experimental works, Electronic Sound by George, and Unfinished Works 2 by John and Yoko, released on Apple's experimental branch, Zapple, run by Paul's good friend Barry Miles. Of the two releases on this date, George would very candidly remark years later, "See, we conceived of an offshoot of Apple Records that would be arty music that wouldn't normally gain an outlet, but as with so many things at Apple, it seized up before it really got going. Both of the albums that did come out are a load of rubbish." And indeed, the works were not well received. Zapple would be closed by Alan Klein a month later. The controversy of their first bed-in did not dissuade John and Yoko from performing another, and if anything, the enormous amount of press they received was very encouraging. They initially chose New York City as their next prime destination, but due to John's cannabis charge at the hands of the reprehensible detective who gave George his, he wasn't even allowed to come into the country at this point.
So anyway, we tried to do it in New York, but the American government wouldn't let us in. But we ended up doing it in Montreal instead, and broadcasting across the border, answering all these questions many times. It got down to all we were saying was give peace a chance. So we recorded it in the bedroom of the Montreal Hilton or whatever hotel we were in.
On an 8-track machine.
As mentioned earlier as well, the team was still trying to put together the album that would become Let It Be. It was being mixed for its original purpose, that being a raw, simple, and live-sounding performance of the music. And on May 28th, the mixing was finished, but the Beatles hated it and were not at all happy with the results. It was because of this that the album was not released before Abbey Road despite being recorded before it. As we know, the album would end up being remixed and produced by Phil Spector near the peak of the Beatles' dissolution, but at this point, it was simply shelved. 2 days later, a single was released, just 25 days after Get Back, the ballad of John and Yoko and its B-side, Old Brown Shoe. Whew, I'm tired. Are you tired? Thankfully, June was an incredibly slow month by Beatles standards, as John and Yoko and George and Patty both enjoyed holidays. The only press conducted during this time was John and Yoko's interview on the David Frost Show on the 14th. But the schedule was set. On July 1st, the sessions for Abbey Road would begin, and the Beatles would finally work day to day on the album rather than sporadically. So of course, John would crash his car on the very same day. It is July 1st, 1969, the very first day of the Abbey Road recording sessions. But John Lennon is not there. He is currently at a petrol station near the village of Tongue in Scotland, and being John, he cannot go anywhere without signing a few autographs. And after he does so, he climbs into the driver's seat of his car. Next to him, of course, is Yoko Ono, and in the back seat sit both John's son Julian and Yoko's daughter Kyoko. He pulls out of the station. The weather is poor, rainy and foggy. Now, John has always been a poor driver, let alone for the fact that for about 6 years now he's been chauffeured just about everywhere he goes. He only received his driver's license in 1965, and since then has only driven locally near his home in Weybridge. They drive upon a remote single-track road. Suddenly, in the distance, approaches another vehicle, driven by a German tourist. On a single-track road such as this, the rules state that both cars should come to a stop and each try to find a suitable place in which to pull over to allow the other to pass. It seems, though, that neither driver is aware of this rule. The cars accelerate toward each other, and in a moment of dumb panic, John simply takes his hands off of the wheel. The car swerves violently, and then rolls into a ditch. The impact of the crash causes the occupants' heads to whip forward, causing facial injuries and rendering them briefly unconscious from the force of the blow. The only one spared, miraculously it seems, was Julian, who was sitting on the floor well behind Yoko. The car came to a stop. 6-year-old Julian crawled out of the vehicle while the others sat unresponsive. He began to cry. The other vehicle kept driving. Not too long after, in a stroke of luck, someone spotted the crashed vehicle and after checking on them, dashed off to a nearby farm where they phoned for an ambulance. Due to the remoteness of the location, it took an hour to arrive. They were taken to the Lawson Memorial Hospital where John was given 17 facial stitches, Kyoko 4, and Yoko 14 stitches in her forehead, as well as injuring her back. Little Julian was not injured. John and Yoko spent 5 days in the hospital. Yoko took the brunt of the crash and was also pregnant at the time, so there was extra care taken to ensure her health. Cynthia, John's ex-wife, came quickly to pick up Julian and found that he had already been picked up by John's aunt, Mater. On Cynthia's arrival, John refused to see her. Then soon after, Yoko's ex-husband, Anthony Cox, came to get Kyoko. It was now just John and Yoko alone. And so, on July 1st, Paul was the only Beatle present as he recorded the first lead vocal for You Never Give Me Your Money. Also present was George Martin, who for the most part had decided he no longer wanted to work with the group. The White Album sessions were fraught and full of conflict, and the Let It Be sessions were even more of a disaster. So he was surprised when Paul rang him up and said, "We want to make another record. Will you produce it for us? Really produce it?" And George Martin said, "Yes, if I am really allowed to produce it." And thank goodness he did.
Once there was a way.
So as many of you may know, Paul's home was quite literally less than a 10-minute walk from EMI Studios. And because of this, he was almost always the first there, and always got right to work. And so, alone in the studio, Paul decided to record a short little ditty called Her Majesty. Paul had it finished in 3 takes. When George and Ringo arrived, they began work on another Paul track, this one inspired by prose he had read in a book of children's nursery rhymes, Golden Slumbers. The original words were written all the way back in the 16th century by playwright Thomas Dekker. Here's Paul. I was playing the piano in Liverpool in my dad's house, and my stepsister Ruth's piano book was up on the stand. I was flicking through it and I came to Golden Slumbers. I can't read music and I couldn't remember the old tune, so I just started playing my own tune to it. I liked the words, so I kept them, and it fitted with another bit of song I had. This last line suggests that he had already composed Carry That Weight, and so put this song together to serve as its companion piece. So it was not only Golden Slumbers that they recorded, but Carry That Weight as well, considered here as one song rather than 2. This was another song that reflected Paul's emotional turmoil at this time. We were entering a period in the mid to late 60s when we were doing LSD, staying up all night, then wishing it would wear off, discovering it wouldn't. A bad trip could leave you feeling a bit heavy instead of enjoying the normal lightness of youth. That was coupled with the business problems at Apple Records, which really were horrible. The business meetings were just soul-destroying. We'd sit around in an office, and it was a place you just didn't want to be, with people you didn't want to be with. There's a great picture that Linda took of Alan Klein, in which he's got a hammer, like Maxwell's silver hammer. It's very symbolic. They spent the next couple of days working on overdubs. And when they came in the next week, they would begin work on what would become one of the band's most popular songs going forward. Here Comes the Sun was written by George in Eric Clapton's garden. Here's George. Here Comes the Sun was written at the time when Apple was getting like school, where we had to go and be businessmen. Sign this and sign that. Anyway, it seems as if winter in England goes on forever. By the time spring comes, you really deserve it. So one day I decided I was going to sag off Apple, and I went over to Eric Clapton's house. The relief of not having to go and see all those dopey accountants was wonderful, and I walked around the garden with one of Eric's acoustic guitars and wrote Here Comes the Sun. Are you all noticing a recurring theme in the songs of this album? Today also marked a couple of other notable events. First off, Ringo's 29th birthday. I hope they had cake for him in the studio. And secondly, John's first non-Beatles single was released, Give Peace a Chance, under the name Plastic Ono Band. Oh no, what is that sound? Dread it, run from it. There is no escaping Maxwell's silver hammer. The song actually has a long history. It began all the way back in 1966 when Paul turned on the radio.
With the radio on, and there was this play that caught my ear, Zulu Kaku. I really liked it.
The play was described as a pataphysical extravaganza, and those words stuck in Paul's head for some years.
John was quizzical, studied pataphysical science in the home.
The song was actually written sometime in early 1968. In fact, it was very nearly recorded as a last-second addition to the White Album. Then it was rehearsed during the Let It Be sessions. But never yet had it been recorded until this day, the same day that John and Yoko returned following their car accident. The others waited in the studio for John and Yoko's arrival. There was a tension in the air, as if they were almost scared to see what John was like at this moment. But when he arrived, he seemed to be in good enough spirits. But where was Yoko? Suddenly, as the engineering team was setting up mics, a double-wide mattress was brought into the studio. An ambulance arrived outside, and Yoko was carried in and softly lowered onto the mattress. Then John requested a mic be set up above her, just in case she wanted to participate. Engineer Ron Richards walked into the scene, and in disbelief, walked up to John. "What the bloody hell is all this?" According to Richards, John was very touchy about it, so he quickly dropped the subject. Nonetheless, double-wide mattress or not, recording went on, as they recorded 21 takes of Maxwell's Silver Hammer on this day. They spent the last couple of hours overdubbing guitars. Today, an anvil was brought in for Ringo, just as they had done for Mal Evans some months earlier. They overdubbed piano, and a guitar played through a Leslie speaker, a technique that George loved to utilize during these sessions. Then they overdubbed Paul's lead vocal. 13 remixes were performed at the end of the session, suggesting that the song was considered finished. That was not to be the case, as the next day, they came in and recorded even more overdubs for Maxwell's. Now this song has a reputation of being an absolute nightmare to record, with multiple incidents of the other Beatles complaining.
Maxwell's Silver Hammer. That's Paul's, I hate it, because all I remember is the track. He made us do it 100 million times. He did everything to make it into a single, and it never was, and it never could have been. But he put guitar licks on it, and he had Mal hitting iron pieces, and we spent more money on that song than any on the whole album, I think.
But as far as I can tell from the studio notes, this song was not half the ordeal to record that Obla Di Obla Da was, the other song that lives in infamy due to Paul's perfectionism. It is worth noting that a little over 2 whole days were devoted wholly to the song, or put another way, around 17 hours of recording work, which does sound maddening. And since we are talking tension, now would be a good time to share a very well-known story, that of Yoko Ono and her theft of George Harrison's McVitie's digestive biscuit. One fateful day, George stepped out of the studio and into the control room, leaving behind on the Leslie speaker cabinet his biscuit, and it was there, from the control room, that he saw Yoko rise from her bed, walk over, take, and begin eating his biscuit. This would lead to a shouting match between George and John, where the time came for them to finally air out all of their pent-up frustrations with each other. The entirety of the next week would be spent on overdubs for existing rhythm tracks. Some examples being the harmonium for Here Comes the Sun, as well as many of the fun sound effects for Octopus's Garden, including the sound of Ringo blowing bubbles in a cup of water. All the while, Paul kept coming in early every single day and attempting the lead vocal for Oh Darling.
When you told me you didn't need me anymore, well, you know, I nearly broke down and cried.
Engineer Alan Parsons recalls, He'd come in, sing it, and say, "No, that's not it. I'll try it again tomorrow." He only tried it once per day. I suppose he wanted to try and capture a certain rawness, which could only be done once before the voice changed. I remember him saying, 5 years ago I could have done this in a flash. So far to this point, John had kept a low profile in the studio and seemed to still be in a dry spell. But on Monday, he came back with a vengeance with his song, Come Together. In remembrance of the song, John was uncharacteristically positive. The only other song of his I've heard him speak so highly of was Happiness is a Warm Gun.
And Come Together was an expression that Leary and Rosemary had come up with for his attempt at being president or whatever he wanted to be.
What John and Yoko are doing here, what the kids are doing in Berkeley, planting trees in the park, and what we're doing in our campaign for governor is part of this great movement, a revulsion against the old-fashioned politics.
And they'd asked me to write them a single, a song, a campaign song. And I tried and I tried and I tried and I couldn't come up with it. But I came up with this Come Together, which would be no good to, they couldn't have a campaign song like that, right? So I wrote another little thing called Come Together and Join the Party, Come Together and Join the Party. And it never got further than that, and they never came back to ask for the song. But I know Leary attacked me years later saying I ripped him off. I didn't rip him off. I had it there waiting for him. It's just that it turned into Come Together. What am I going to do, give it to him? Really? It's one of my favorite Beatles tracks. It's funky, it's bluesy, and I'm singing it pretty well.
This campaign of Leary's was abruptly ended when he was arrested for cannabis possession. When Leary eventually heard the Beatles' recording of the song, originally intended for his campaign, he was a bit bewildered. Although the new version was certainly a musical and lyrical improvement on my campaign song, I was a bit miffed that Lennon had passed me over this way. When I sent a mild protest to John, he replied with typical Lennon charm and wit that he was a tailor and I was a customer who had ordered a suit and never returned, so he sold it to someone else. There is of course some controversy surrounding this song, as it borrowed its opening line from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me.
Yeah, come on, flat top. He was moving up with me, then come.
John was sued by Berry's publisher, Morris Levy, and settled out of court. One of the stipulations of the settlement, somewhat funnily, was that John record more songs owned by Levy as a way to generate revenue for the publisher. The result was his 1975 album, Rock and Roll, which contained Berry's Sweet Little 16 and You Can't Catch Me. Take one of the song was extremely simple and terrific for it. John played no instrument, as he simply sang and delivered a signature, biting vocal, clapping his hands together after each "Shoot Me," he sang. So begins work on one of the more collaborative Beatle tracks of the past few years, at this point called Ending, soon to be renamed The End. This would turn out to be a truly special day in the studio, and one full of novelties yet unseen in a Beatles recording. A Ringo drum solo, and a trio of guitar solos. The thing that always amused me was how much persuasion it took to get Ringo to play that solo. Usually, you have to try to talk drummers out of doing solos. He didn't want to do it, but everybody said, no, it'll be fantastic. So he gave in, and turned in a bloody marvelous performance. It took a while to get right, and I think Paul helped with some ideas, but it's fantastic. I always want to hear it more. That's how good it is. It's so musical. It's not just a drummer going off. In the 7 takes they recorded, the style of drum solo changed every single time, showing that Ringo never had any particular plan in place. He simply went off the cuff, with some ideas from Paul, if Emmerich is correct in saying so. And then in recollection of the dueling guitar solos, Emmerich would say, "The idea for guitar solos was very spontaneous, and everybody said, yes, definitely. Well, except for George, who was a little apprehensive at first, but he saw how excited John and Paul were, so he went along with it. Truthfully, I think they rather liked the idea of playing together, not really trying to outdo one another per se, but engaging in some real musical bonding. Yoko was about to go into the studio with John, and he actually told her, no, not now. Let me just do this. It'll just take a minute. That surprised me a bit. Maybe he felt he was returning to his roots with the boys. Who knows? And the magic seemed to rub off even further, as at the end of the day, after toiling away for weeks, Paul gave the lead vocal for Oh Darling another go. And it was on this day he would record his brilliant final attempt.
Oh, Johnny.
George is getting silly, George. Sir, George is getting silly.
Despite finally nailing the elusive vocal for Oh Darling, Paul still arrived early the next day for one particular reason: to record a demo of a song he had written to be given to the group Badfinger. The song was named Come and Get It. And this was not just a simple demo. Paul took the time to overdub an entire rhythm track and would end up producing Badfinger's own version of the song. Good work, Paul. Once the day really began, they got to work on a couple of John contributions to the medley, Sun King and Mean Mr. Mustard. Much like Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight, they were not recorded as two separate tracks, but as a continuous one, which in this particular example actually surprised me, just due to how different sounding the two songs are. The hypnotic guitar passage that opens the song was influenced by Fleetwood Mac's Albatross. At the time, Albatross was out with all the reverb on guitar. So we said, let's be Fleetwood Mac doing Albatross. It never really sounded like Fleetwood Mac, but that was the point of origin. The song eventually descends into a strange string of nonsense Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, with the odd English phrase thrown in. When we came to sing it, to make them different, we started joking, saying cuando para mucho. We just made it up. Paul knew a few Spanish words from school, so we just strung any Spanish words that sounded vaguely like something. Mean Mr. Mustard was a song written by John in India, and was another song considered for inclusion on the White Album. The song actually has its roots from back in 1967, when John read in the Daily Mirror an article about a miserly old man named John Alexander Mustard, who had been taken to divorce court by his wife on account of his meanness.
I'd read somewhere in the newspaper about this mean guy who, something about hiding £5 notes, not up his nose, but somewhere else. And it has nothing to do with cocaine or snorting.
They ended up recording 35 takes of the songs.
She came in through the bathroom window.
And now on Friday, another two songs recorded as one. Paul's She Came In Through the Bathroom Window and John's Polythene Pam. Let's hear first from Paul. I'm still amused by the distinction of a woman who could steal, but she could not rob. A nice distinction if there ever was one. And that, of course, goes back to the fact that a woman did actually sneak into my house through the bathroom window that was a bit ajar. A fan, apparently, one of a group called the Apple Scruffs. She found a ladder lying outside my home in London. As far as I recall, she stole a picture of my cotton salesman dad, or robbed me of it, but I got the song in return. In an anecdote by devoted Apple Scruff Margot Bird, she claims that these break-ins into Paul's house were not even that unusual. There were really two groups of Apple Scruffs, those who would break in and those who would just wait outside with cameras and autograph books. I used to take Paul's dog for a walk and got to know him quite well. The line, "And so I quit the police department," was inspired quite serendipitously by an unusual name that Paul spotted. Following a visit to Linda Eastman in late 1968, Paul was escorted back to JFK Airport, where he saw his driver's identification on the dashboard panel. It read, Eugene quits, New York Police Department. Now what about Polythene Pam, another John song written in India? Will he call it a piece of garbage too? He actually refrained this time, as he seems to find humor in the origin of this song. The inspiration dates all the way back to 1960, with the band's acquaintance with beat poet Royston Ellis.
Crawling round the darkness of a seething...
Let's hear it from John.
That was me remembering a little event with a woman in Jersey, an island off the French coast which belongs to English, and a man called Roy something, who was England's answer to Allen Ginsberg. He was a beatnik that looked like a beatnik, and he came, and there weren't any jazz groups, there was only the Beatles, so it was the first rock and roll and poetry. He read poetry and we played blues, and he mentioned this in the paper. Years later he had a job in Jersey TV. I met him when we were big and on tour, and he took me back to his apartment. I had a girl and he had one that he'd said, you want to meet her? Polythene Pam. She dresses up in polythene, which she did, in polythene bags. And yeah, well, it was kind of, perverted sex in a polythene bag. There was nothing really much to it.
The first 2 days of the next week were spent on overdubs for Polythene Pam. She came in through the bathroom window, Come Together, and Sun King / Mean Mr. Mustard. When they came into the studio on the 30th, the goal was clear: to stitch together a rough draft of what the Beatles were currently calling the long one, aka the medley. Not all the songs were in a finished state. For example, the end did not yet have vocals, but the idea was to see how everything fit together, what needed fixing and what didn't. And there was one song in particular that Paul thought didn't work: Her Majesty. The song was initially placed between Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam.
Her Majesty's pretty nice. Someday I'm gonna make her mine.
Engineer John Kurlander tells the story. We did all the remixes and crossfades to overlap the song. Paul was there, and we heard it together for the first time. He said, I don't like Her Majesty, throw it away. So I cut it out, but I accidentally left in the last note. He said, it's only a rough mix, it doesn't matter. In other words, don't bother about making a clean edit because it's only a rough mix. I said to Paul, what shall I do with it? Throw it away, he replied. I'd been told never to throw anything away, so after he left I picked it up off the floor, put about 20 seconds of red leader tape before it, and stuck it onto the end of the edit tape. The next day, down at Apple, Malcolm Davis cut a playback lacquer of the whole sequence. When Paul listened to the medley again the next day, he heard, after 20 seconds, Her Majesty is the very last piece, and he liked it. The song was never remixed, and this reveals the answer to the mystery. What happened to the last chord of Her Majesty in the final mix?
Someday I'm gonna make her mine. Someday I'm gonna make her mine.
Well, it was left in the rough initial mix, as the last note of Mean Mr. Mustard, as noted by Kurlander when he said, I accidentally left in the last note. This also explains the crashing electric guitar chord at the beginning of Her Majesty. Besides Her Majesty, the only transition that gave them any trouble was between You Never Give Me Your Money and Sun King. They tried a couple of different solutions, but the perfect fit was not discovered on this day.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Here we see the birth of a song that was inspired by Bach's Moonlight Sonata, Because. Yoko was playing Moonlight Sonata on the piano. She was classically trained. I said, can you play those chords backward? And wrote Because around them. The lyrics speak for themselves. They're clear. No bullshit. No imagery. No obscure references. This was a song that George Harrison held in very high regard. John wrote this tune. The backing is a bit like Beethoven and has 3-part harmony right throughout. I think this is possibly my favorite one on the album. The lyrics are so simple. The harmony was pretty difficult to sing. We had to really learn it. But I think that's one of the tunes that will impress most people. It's really good. And the harmonies proved the most difficult the Beatles had attempted in a very long time, as not since This Boy.
To love you
and Yes It Is.
And what's more is true. Yes, it is.
Had they put in the same amount of effort to really hammer down the harmonies. They recorded multiple tracks of the vocals, 3 for each of them, for a total sum of 9.
Because the wind.
And the perfect transition between You Never Give Me Your Money and Sun King would come to Paul on this day, as he came to Abbey Road Studios with a bag of his own home-recorded tapes, a collection of bells and birds and crickets that slotted in prettily between the 2 songs. It was also on this day that the Moog synthesizer was brought into the studio, a huge, multi-tiered and spaghetti-wired monstrosity. They were to use it for overdubs throughout the album, beginning with Because. Engineer Nick Webb would remark, "I think the Beatles used the Moog with great subtlety. Others in a similar situation would probably have gone completely over the top with it. It's there, on the record, but not obtrusively." So it was around this point, with all of the basic tracks recorded, that the Beatles began to split up and perform overdubs on their own respective songs. Keeping at least 2 studios running at any given point. The album was near complete, and so all that was left were the final touches. On the morning of Friday, August 8th, the Beatles came together at Abbey Road, along with photographer and friend to John and Yoko, Ian Macmillan. Paul had brought along a sketch of his idea for the cover, an excruciatingly simple idea. The 4 Beatles walking across Abbey Road. The working title had been Everest, based on the type of cigarettes that engineer Geoff Emerick smoked. At some point, though, this was dropped, and somehow the Beatles fell into what would be both the easiest and most enduring solution. They spent 10 minutes shooting the album cover, and Ian only took 6 pictures of the Beatles walking across the road. We'll skip now to Friday, August 15th, which was to be a session devoted to one purpose, the orchestral overdubs for the entirety of the album. For the first time in a Beatles session, closed-circuit television was utilized to link 2 studios together, so George Martin could conduct the musicians in one studio, while Geoff Emerick and the team monitored from the other. "It was a mammoth session," recalled Alan Brown. "We had a large number of lines linking the studios, and we were all walking around the building with walkie-talkies, trying to communicate with each other. The orchestral overdub for The End was the most elaborate I have ever heard. It cost a lot of money. All the musicians have to be paid, fed, and watered. I screw every pound note out of it whenever I play the record." The first song to be recorded for Abbey Road, John's I Want You, ended up being one of the last tracks finished. Let's catch up real quick since it's been a while. In February, with Billy Preston, they recorded 35 takes of the song, which was edited down to a best take using 3 different versions. This is the original Trident tape. Since then, they've recorded many overdubs, but some of those overdubs were done on the original, while some have been done on a copy of the original. It's a mouthful to try and explain, but essentially, today, they have 2 extremely similar, but slightly different tapes of the same song that they need to splice together in order to have all of the elements that John desires. So for the final version, the copied tape composes the first 4 minutes and 37 seconds, while the original Trident tape covers the remaining 3 minutes and 7 seconds. It was John's decision to cut the song suddenly with a full volume slash rather than a fade out. He had added the swirling white noise from the Moog synthesizer on the 8th, and that, combined with the continually repeating guitar arpeggios, helped build an enormous wall of sound that, when suddenly cut, had a jarring and powerful effect. It was that cut that would end side 1 of the record. The rest of the day would be spent putting together the final master for the album and hammering down the running order. This was to be the last day that all 4 Beatles were in a recording studio at the same time. 2 days later, they would all attend a photo session at John and Yoko's new home at Tittenhurst Park. And then just 6 days after that, Paul and Linda would have their first child together, Mary McCartney, named after Paul's mother. A matter of weeks later, the band was essentially dead. Abbey Road is an astonishing piece of work, even outside the context of the Beatles' imminent demise. The Beatles did their best to put up a good front, but it only went so far. "You didn't want to get involved," said engineer Phil McDonald, but people would be walking out, banging instruments down, not turning up on time and keeping the others waiting 3 or 4 hours, then blaming each other for not having rehearsed or not having played their bit right. It was very distressing. On Tuesday, September 9th, John, Paul, and George came together at Apple headquarters to discuss their future plans. Ringo wasn't there, so they brought along a tape recorder. "Ringo, you can't be here, but this is so you can hear what we're discussing," said John. They discussed plans for a new album, and with George burgeoning as a songwriter, John broached the subject of allowing George greater influence within the band. A single perhaps, and more tracks on the upcoming album. But the discussion quickly devolved into an argument, not between any specific Beatle, but between all of them at once. The following is taken from Anthony Fawcett's One Day at a Time. "Well, the thing is," Paul answered, without even looking at George, who sat a few feet away, "I think that until now, until this year, our songs have been better than George's. Now this year, his songs are at least as good as ours." George was quick to correct Paul. "Now that's a myth, because most of the songs this year I wrote about last year or the year before anyway. Maybe now I just don't care whether you are going to like them or not. I just do them. If I didn't get a break, I wouldn't push it. I'd just forget about it. Now for the last 2 years, at any rate, I've pushed it a bit more." "I know what he's saying," John said, "because people have said to me you're coming through a lot stronger now than you had." "I don't particularly seek acclaim," George said. "That's not the thing. It's just to get out, whatever is there, to make way for whatever else is there. You know, because it's only to get 'em out. And also, I might as well make a bit of money, seeing as I'm spending as much as the rest of you, and I don't earn as much as the rest of you. Most of my tunes," he said, "I never had the Beatles backing me." "Oh, come on, George," John shouted. "We put a lot of work in your songs, even down to Don't Bother Me. We spent a lot of time doing all that and we grooved. I can remember the riff you were playing, and in the last 2 years there was a period where you went Indian and we weren't needed." "That was only one tune," George said. "On the last album, I don't think you appeared on any of my songs. I don't mind." "Well, you had Eric or somebody like that," John replied, in a hurt tone of voice. There was a long pause as each Beatle seemed lost in contemplation, not wanting to admit that they were becoming individual musicians. Paul grasped at the remnants of truth and spoke slowly, almost whispering. "When we get in a studio, even on the worst day, I'm still playing bass, Ringo's still drumming, and we're still there, you know?" 3 days later, John Lennon would decide to leave the Beatles. The rest of that story will have to wait till next time. Thank you so very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing or checking out my older videos. I also have a Patreon you can join for $1 a month, where you can watch the videos early. If you are able to, that is a great way to help me out. Once again, thank you so much. Until next time.